Thank you very much. First of all, I'm of course very sad that Tinka can't be here today. This paper wasn't a presentation before and has become a presentation in the last few days. So please forgive any sort of difficulties understanding it the way it is. But I'm really happy to have the chance to speak at this conference because the theme is really at the heart of the research I've been doing in the last couple of years, and I'm really interested in what you all have to say about this paper, and so it's great to be part of this conference, not only as a guest but also as a speaker, especially because there are so many competent people in the discussion. So looking forward to that. My paper is on Émilie du Châtelet's principle of contradiction, and it compares her principle of contradiction or non-contradiction, whatever you prefer, to Leibniz and Wolff's principle of contradiction. So the most precise expression of the principle of contradiction is to be found in the fourth paragraph of the first chapter of the Institution de Physique, entitled "Of the Principles of Knowledge," and she writes, "Contradiction is that which simultaneously affirms and denies the same thing. This principle is the first axiom on which all truths are founded." The PC is, along with the principle of sufficient reason, the foundation of her entire subsequent inquiry into nature and our knowledge thereof. So it's the very foundation, it's the first axiom, she says here. So given her own emphasis on the central role of the principle of contradiction for her account of knowledge, it is surprising just how little has been said about it in scholarship. So we've got a couple of sentences about it in Detlefsen's entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia, and then we've got a German article by Andreas Blank, who, I won't go into a lot of detail with this article, but I think that he reads her a lot in a Wolffian sense, and one part of this paper is to show that that's not entirely the way I'd like her to be read. These are like one of the two scholarship pieces to mention that really go a little bit into the principle of contradiction themselves. But otherwise, we don't really have a whole lot of scholarship on the principle of contradiction in du Châtelet. And the most obvious reason for this desideratum is that, as du Châtelet herself highlights, the principle of contradiction has been a principle of philosophy since antiquity. So one worry we might have is, what's new about this principle of contradiction? Aristotle used it, the scholastics used it, and the early moderns used it as well. So what's new here? And furthermore, her formulation of the principle is neither entirely new nor extraordinarily extensive. So Wolff has a lot more, say, text-wise. If you just count the pages, he's written a lot about the principle of contradiction. So how extensive is it, what she actually writes about it? And then the second reason is that du Châtelet explicitly states herself that her first chapters, which treat the principles of knowledge, God, and the concepts of essence, attribute, and mode, are an interpretation of Leibniz and Wolff's exposition of these concepts. So she says, in the first chapters, I explain to you the principal opinions of Mr. Leibniz in metaphysics. I have drawn them from the works of the celebrated Wolff, of whom you have heard me speak so much, with one of his disciples, who was for some time in my household and who sometimes made abstracts for me. So she refers to Samuel Koenig here. So a couple of words about this quote. I don't think we should take her too seriously, and that's because she has many reasons why she might, many motives why she might have said this, and a lot of them are not philosophical at all. So in the 17th and 18th century, there was still a very strong narrative that it's suitable for girls to be educated in literature, in the languages, partly in the natural sciences, in geometry and algebra, but not in philosophy. This is one reason why she might call to some better well-known authors here. Then another thing is that she was involved in what we'd call today a copyright dispute with exactly the named person here, one of the disciples of Wolff. So she might have thought, if I put this in here, I have less stress afterwards, and I've already said that they've got like some sort of reference. And then one thing is, of course, popularity. So if we have certain musicians, before they make the stage themselves, they are like the supporters of some other band. And so was, for example, Jimi Hendrix, and we don't see him like later as a supporter of these bands, but as a musician in his own right. So maybe there's like this perspective here as well. So many people did know Leibniz, many people did know Wolff. So maybe there's like some sort of, these people are popular and I'm gonna stand in this line. So many reasons why this is maybe not philosophically motivated at all, but even if it was, then I'm gonna argue that maybe she didn't see the strong differences that are involved herself. So I believe that both reasons incorrectly led scholarship away from a closer examination of the principle of contradiction, and that by investigating her understanding of this fundamental principle in closer detail, we can gain an important insight into her account of knowledge, which is both original and precise. So in this paper, I wish to show that contrary to du Châtelet's own statement, which I quoted above in similar sounding passages, at closer inspection, her understanding of the PC is in fact rather different from Leibniz and Wolff. And I believe that we can find out about this by not only looking at the formulation of the principle of contradiction itself, but in what context it stands. So if we have a fundament of some sort, it's not always the same. It's a different thing if something is a fundament of a bridge or something is a fundament of a house. And it's a different thing of what is this axiom, this principle of contradiction, a principle for. This is the structure. First, I'll say a little bit about common historiographic placing of du Châtelet in scholarship, and then we're going to go into the more concrete comparison. So in 1738, du Châtelet withdrew a previous version of the Institution de Physique from the press, and Barber and Lochner, and I think Aaron as well, see the most likely cause for retracting this first version in the fact that she had been working on Leibniz and Wolff in the preceding few years and had accumulated material she considered indispensable for the theme at hand. And the material added latterly most likely comprised large parts of Chapter 1 on the principles of knowledge, parts of Chapter 3 on the definition of essences, attributes, and mode, and parts of the preface as well as paragraphs in the chapters on space and time respectively. And these passages run more or less parallel to her presentation of her account of knowledge, of nature in the Institution de Physique. And consequently, and with respect to her own statement on the roots of her metaphysics I quoted above, like this reference to Leibniz and Wolff, du Châtelet has been interpreted as providing a Leibnizian or Wolffian underpinning to Newtonian physics. So we have that in Janik 1982 and Detlefsen 2014. Detlefsen says, yeah, I think this picture is principally right, as mediating between Leibniz and Newton, and as synthesizing Newtonian mechanics with Leibniz-Wolffian metaphysics. So that's Sloan. And the underlying idea of all of these interpretations is that du Châtelet's exposition of metaphysics, or the foundational principles of her knowledge, of her account of knowledge, are Leibnizian or Wolffian, or at least most strongly influenced by those two authors, and that her physics is Newtonian, or at least most notably determined through his work. And the literature has differing views on what exactly belongs to the metaphysics bit and what belongs to the physics side, and many scholars are not precise about this. And also du Châtelet only says that in the first chapters she presents Leibniz's metaphysical opinions, and it is all but clear which chapters fall under this and which not. But roughly the idea is that these themes here on the first side sort of belong to metaphysics, the principles of knowledge, the proof of the existence of God, so the second chapter, and all the attributes of God, essence, attribute, mode, and substance, so the third chapter, and maybe this idea about simple beings and phenomena in the seventh chapter, and then that this side is more sort of on the physics side, the interaction of bodies, gravity, space-time, movement, change, physical causes, and so on. And especially with space and time, it's obviously a bit confusing because we could also say this is on the other side. There are many methodological reasons and also some reasons in the content why du Châtelet's position in history has been seen from this perspective. And one main issue is that if you rediscover an author many years later, to make them known, you have to fit them into some sort of pre-described history. So if I said to you, there's a read of Surein, and you have absolutely no idea who that is, I need to tell you something about philosophers in antiquity and where her theory sort of fits in, because otherwise you just have absolutely no concept to know by this name, right? And so that's an important thing to do, because otherwise we might think there are no women in philosophy in antiquity, which is not the case, as Ruth has continually pointed out for us, and maybe we just have a lot of early modern women we write about because the early modern scholars are so much better historians of philosophy. I think there's like a really tempting thing why we might go that way. And when I first spoke to Ruth about this and about the labeling, sort of the title of Émilie du Châtelet between Leibniz and Newton, she's like, it's advertisement. Like, you're in a luxurious position. You can just go right into the content. When I first started, nobody had ever heard of du Châtelet, and people said there were no women in the history of philosophy at all. So I think if we then go sort of deeper into the content, we have to ask ourselves, how adequate is the narrative we create to actually grasping the content of this author? And this is sort of where we are in recovering these writings. And so the question is she actually only uniting Newton with Leibniz and Wolff, or maybe it's time to sort of overcome this narrative, and that's where I see myself as a scholar sort of working on. So recent scholarship has not only put into question whether the distinction between metaphysics on the one hand and physics on the other as two separate endeavors is a legitimate approach to the institution de physique, like Catherine has notably done, along with the question of how Newtonian her physics actually are. It's a work that Marius Stan has recently published, but has also begun to show that Du Châtelet's metaphysics are neither straightforwardly Leibnizian, so Fatima Amiti has shown this with respect to her PSR, nor Wolffian. Michael Körperschök, for example, and Aaron Wells have shown this. So Du Châtelet once termed Wolff en grand bavard en métaphysique, and her indecisiveness with regard to the theory of monads hints at differences with Leibniz too. And these hints, along with recent scholarship, show that the story of Du Châtelet's Leibnizian or Wolffian metaphysics deserves a closer investigation. The PC is one of the central themes in this story, and this paper contributes towards a closer investigation of Du Châtelet's metaphysical roots. So the long and short is that I think that the textual differences may be subtle, but that they in effect establish an entirely different account of knowledge or Erkenntnistheorie in Du Châtelet than it is in Leibniz and Wolff. And we can find out about this if we look at what the PC is a principle for in Leibniz, in Wolff, and in Du Châtelet. How did we get to that principle? And also, the PC is clearly a statement that something has to do with contradiction or non-contradiction. But what is it that is contradictory or non-contradictory? And what does the PC do for us in the account of knowledge and in the sciences? And I will say that that's significantly different in Du Châtelet than it is in Leibniz and Wolff. So before I turn to Leibniz and Wolff in particular, they've both written tons, and I've read a lot, but not all of their work. So it may well be that you're like, oh, but Leibniz says that too, and Wolff says that too, but and maybe they do, but if they do, they at least also tell a different story, one that Du Châtelet does not tell. So even if they have something that's akin to Du Châtelet's picture in them, then they are not decided on this. And so that's how my argument goes. And Leibniz has thematized the principle of contradiction many times, but I focus here on his PC in the monadology, and the reason is that in this he doesn't really want to point out anything else, so he really wants to explain to us what is that principle of contradiction, and that's why I think it's really suited to looking at that passage. And he says here, our reasonings are grounded upon two great principles, that of contradiction, in virtue of which we judge false that which involves a contradiction, and true that which is opposed or contradictory to it. So, as false. Leibniz formulates the PC is here explicitly a principle for correct reasoning or correct judgment. And Leibniz introduces the PC as, in the monadology, as one of the two principles of our reasonings in the context of eternal and necessary truths. So according to Leibniz, it is the ability to recognize necessary and eternal truths which distinguishes the human being from simple animals and grants us reason and the sciences. That's in paragraph 29. And in the subsequent paragraphs, he provides us with one of the most fundamental explanations of the PC. what he says here and I quote this in the longer passage: through our knowledge of necessary truth and the abstractions they involve, we are also raised to the level of reflective acts which make each of us aware of the thing that is called I, and lets us think that this or that thing is in ourselves. And by thinking of ourselves in this way, we think of being, of substance, of simples and composites, of what is immaterial, and of God himself, through the thought that what is limited in us is limitless in him. And these acts of reflection provide the principal objects of our reasonings. Our reasonings are based on two great principles: the principle of contradiction, and that's where he gives that first quote, and the principle of sufficient reason. Let us thus take Leibniz's line of argumentation apart into its singular steps. So, because it's quite complicated, right? Like, how does this argument actually go? So he says, first, we know of eternal and necessary truths. Then the second step is this knowledge of eternal and necessary truths makes reflective acts possible. These reflective acts make us think an I, being, substance, simples, composites, the immaterial, and God. And the reflective acts form the principal objects of our reasonings. And then our reasonings, that's where the PC comes in. Our reasonings are based on the PC and the PSR. So on first sight, the passage of argumentation appears to be somewhat circular. It is stated in step 5 that by means of the PC and the PSR, we gain knowledge of an I and God, as well as other eternal and necessary truths. So these are the objects set out in step 3 and 4. Yet the first premise seems to suggest that we already know of eternal and necessary truths from the beginning, so as in step 1, and that this knowledge is in fact the basis for having an object for our reasonings in the first place, step 2. So we might, of course, simply assume that Leibniz has not thought this through, and the monadology doesn't really give us a clear explanation of this. It doesn't go into detail. So we have to resort to some sort of interpretation and explanation of what's in here, how to solve this possible circular view. And so one thing I wanted to suggest, and I think that's sort of right, that we can read it that way and that it doesn't lead us into a lot of trouble with the rest of Leibniz's views on this, is and I think it's also supported by the context and some other writings, for example, in the new essays. And that's to assert that a certain form of knowledge of eternal and necessary truths rests in a human being's soul, something Leibniz calls reason, soul, or spirit. Yet the individual human being does not know these truths consciously until he or she actually makes them an object to themselves in reasoning based on the PC and the PSR. By means of the application of the PC and the PSR in our reasoning, we thus discover the truths that lie ready in our soul. Truths themselves then seem to be something that are given regardless of an individual human being actually knowing them. And the PC and the PSR in this interpretation do not constitute the truths themselves. They do not make anything true. In short, they are simply a means for discovering the truth rather than being the truth itself. This would also explain why Leibniz in his later writings gives a rather formal definition of the PC, and why in the second letter in the correspondence with Clarke, for example, he maintains that the PC asserts that a proposition cannot be true and false at the same time, and therefore A is A and cannot be not A. So it just seems to be like a modus operandi to discover truth and not have like very much metaphysical content itself. So we can say the PC for Leibniz is a principle of our reasonings, so raisonnement, and it enables us to discover eternal truths that are already given in our soul. It's innate. That's something he discusses in the new essays in more detail. So it's reflected sort of in the outside world, but it's intrinsically innate and not dependent upon experience or the senses. And as such, it's a form or means to discover truths, a principle that leads us to discover necessary truths in the sense of their opposite entailing contradiction. So I believe that Leibniz has two differing views of necessity, but that's not something I'll go into here. But yeah, in the case of the PC, that it's necessary truths in the sense of the opposite being contradictory. And the PC for Leibniz is not the truth itself. So it's not really something that creates truths. It's not constitutive of being themselves, or of the existence of material beings or the natural world. And it's not exclusive in the discovery of eternal truths. And that's because the PSR also leads us to the discovery of a certain form of truths that the PC cannot lead us to. So just a note here, that's why I think there are two different versions of necessity. Leibniz claims that God necessarily has created the world. He has lots of arguments that are based on the PSR. I think he thinks that's necessary, that it's the case that God has created the world sort of before space and time, for example, in the Leibniz-Clarke correspondence, but it's not necessary in the sense of the opposite being a contradiction. It's sort of necessary on the basis of the PSR, which is a different form of necessity. So here the PC applies to necessary truths with a sense to it, to the opposite being a contradiction. So we'll now come to Wolff, and he introduces the PC even more explicitly as belonging to our mind. He writes in the first passage of the first chapter of his first ontology or first philosophy or ontology, we experience this as the nature of our mind, that he, like the mind, while he judges that something is, cannot at the same time judge that the same thing is not. So what kind of object does this experience of the nature of our mind in our consciousness relate to in Wolff? So in the first paragraph of the on the PC, Wolff establishes that we experience that we cannot judge that the same thing is and is not at the same time. What is the thing Wolff has in mind here? In the original Latin text, Wolff writes the above quote here, and it's interesting that there's actually no thing or something in the sentence at all. Rather, what is established here is a necessary form of judgment. So it's not really a statement about any particular thing we might think of, like a material thing or like even like an ideal thing. So what he basically says is, if I judge of any X that it is, I cannot judge that X is not at the same time. And at this stage, the PC serves to give judgments a necessary form. They cannot affirm and deny the same thing at the same time. This necessary form of judgment is not linked here to any specific object, but holds true for judgments on any given object. Expressed differently, we can say that the PC is firstly and primarily expressed as a principle of judgment, regardless of what the object of this judgment may be. But Wolff wants to render the PC useful for the acquisition of truths in the sciences, and to this end, he cannot really stop there, right? Like, so we've got this form of judgment. I can say the root of 39 is 4.3, and I cannot say the root of 39 is not 4.3. at the same time, but which one's actually true, I don't know at all. And if I want to make this useful for the sciences, I need to sort of detail how this relates to the object. He explains in a second step that first, so this is how he sort of goes on. First, I cannot see something and judge that I do not see it. Second, I cannot imagine something and judge that I do not imagine it. 3, I cannot realize that something is inherent in a thing I see or imagine and judge that it is not inherent in it. And fourth, if we are convinced that a being has a predicate either absolutely or under certain conditions, it is not in our power to judge that this being does not have this predicate absolutely or under certain conditions. And I think the first notion here, this I cannot see something and judge that I do not see it, is especially interesting here, and the one I want to draw most attention to, since it introduces a material and sensually perceivable object to the PC. So Wolff clearly treats seeing something like the sun, for example, and he takes this example as a factum that cannot be negated. Does this mean that the PC is understood by Wolff as a principle of the natural world, like the sun, independently of us knowing it, as I will argue du Châtelet does? I believe this is not the case, and here's why. Wolff writes in his explanation of the above notion of the application of the PC to seeing, if someone denies that he experiences the same thing in himself, and he does not hesitate to assert that he, while he looks at the sun and is conscious of himself looking at it, can convince himself that he does not see it, etc., we would count him among the insane or the purposefully foolish with whom we do not converse. So we can see here that Wolff applies the PC to the central factum as a representation in our consciousness, rather than to the material, sensually perceivable object itself. Right? So it's an important distinction here. The PC here does not make any statement at all about the actual existence of the sun, or whether it is actually the way I see it. It only purports to see that the sensual perception is a representation in our consciousness, and I cannot judge that this representation is not given in my mind while it is given in my mind. So the PC, what does this mean for the PC itself in Wolff? The PC is firstly and primarily an innate form of judgment, and it belongs to the mind as faculty to judge. As such, it is a conditio sine qua non for judgment, but it does not inherently address the object of the judgment or constitute truth. Yet Wolff was himself loath to leave the determination of the PC here, since he maintains that the PC is the foundation of all logical proof, and claims that the aim of logic is to show how, I quote, the cognitive faculty proceeds in the recognition of truth. End of quote. The PC is thus for Wolff nevertheless, and in an important way, linked to the recognition of truths. So how does Wolff get from the PC as a simple form of judgment to its role for the recognition of truth? Wolff deduces in due course the following sentence from the PC as a form of judgment, I quote, "It cannot happen that something is and is not at the same time." End of quote. In the examples Wolff provides, it becomes evident that the object he has in mind here is not merely a form of judgment itself. He writes, quote, "It cannot happen that the sky is now clear and not clear." It is important to note here that what is expressed is not only a hypothetical assumption, as in, if I judge that the sky is clear, I cannot judge that the sky is not clear. Instead, the contradiction cannot be in the object of the judgment. The sky, in this case, involves latter formulation. So Wolff has now established, and the succession is important here, that first, it is the nature of our mind that we cannot judge that any object of consciousness is and is not at the same time. And second, we thus conclude that if A is B, it is wrong that the same A is not B, or expressed differently, if something, a material object, a mathematical shape, etc., is, it cannot at the same time not be. Wolff has thus deduced from a form of judgment a statement about the general being of objects. This includes material and geometric shapes. So the PCs thus apply to all mathematical material objects via its establishment as a form of judgment. Expressed differently, material, mathematical, and geometrical objects are non-contradictory because our judgment about those objects establishes their non-contradiction, and not material, mathematical, geometrical objects are non-contradictory. This is why we can recognize them as such. In Wolff's subsequent explanation of the role of the PC in logic, it becomes clear that to Wolff, the PC serves to distinguish being and non-being impossibility. So, what's the relationship of the PC to things in the end for Wolff? Wolff derives the very concept of thing, as we have seen above and in the German logic, from the PC. Whatever does not involve a contradiction is a thing, and whatever involves contradiction is nothing. The very concept of a thing is thus derived from the PC as a principle of the mind, and this would suggest that what things are, at least in their possibility, is dependent upon judgment or the PC. However, the human being can overlook given contradiction and thus discover that something they once held to be a thing is actually contradictory, i.e. nothing. Wolff is conscious of this and suggests that an oversight of contradiction is possible, especially in a large number of conclusions. This fact seems to suggest that things are non-contradictory independent of a human being knowing that they are non-contradictory. We can see here that the non-contradiction of beings and the non-contradiction of judgments must be mutually conditioning. Yet Wolff is only explicit about how we get from the PC as a principle of judgment to things and does not address how we get from the given non-contradiction of things to the judgment about them. In fact, I'm not aware of a single passage where he explicitly says or suggests that material, geometric, or other determinations of things must be non-contradictory, independent of the PC as a principle of the mind or of judgment. So this is what I think the PC in the end is for Wolff. It's a formal logical principle of judgment. It belongs to the mind. It's primarily innate. And the PC pertains to the being and non-being of everything. But it's important here that this everything is just deduced from the PC as a logical form of judgment. It's the foundation of all logic. The PSR is also based on the PC for Wolff. And the PC for Wolff is not founded on the non-contradiction in the determinations of beings. It's not dependent on actual beings or their perception, and is not restricted to necessary truths or truths that cannot be otherwise, since it also applies to contingent truths. Yeah, so now the important part. Du Châtelet begins the first chapter of the Institution de Physique entitled The Principles of Our Knowledge with the claim that, I quote, "There are principles whose truth is known without even reflecting on it, and that these truths form the foundation of all knowledge." She will go on to introduce the PC before the PSR as one of the two fundamental principles of knowledge. There is already an important point to note here. In contrast to Leibniz and Wolff, to Du Châtelet the PC as a principle not only of reasoning or of judgment, but of knowledge. While our reasonings, as in Leibniz, or an experience of the mind, as in Wolff, introduce the PC clearly on the side of the subject, the side of the mind, or as an inner principle, knowledge is a term which incorporates the truth or correctness of the judgment in terms of its object. The PC is thus as a principle of knowledge in Du Châtelet, and from the outset, not a logical principle of the mind or of judgment alone. It is also never introduced as a principle that is primarily or in the first instance innate. So on the PC itself, du Châtelet writes, "Contradiction is that which simultaneously affirms and denies the same thing. This principle is the first axiom on which all truths are founded." And we can see in the above that the PC is understood as a truth, which is known intuitively and which forms a fundament for all knowledge. And this suggests that the PC is a fundament for truth and knowledge itself, and not just a tool or method for its discovery. Du Châtelet writes in almost the same wording as Wolff, and this leads blank to his Wolffian interpretation of her PC. I quote, "Contradiction is that which simultaneously affirms and denies the same thing. This principle is the first axiom on which all truth are founded. Everyone readily agrees on this, and it would even be impossible to deny it without lying to one's conscience, for we sense that we cannot force our minds to admit that a thing simultaneously is and is not, and that we cannot have an idea while having it, nor see a white body as if it were black while we see it as white. Even the Pyrrhonists who claim to doubt everything never denied this principle. They effectively denied that reality existed, but they never doubted that they had an idea while they had it in their minds." So this reminds us a lot about this quote I had of Wolff. But the important thing to note here is that for du Châtelet, in contrast to Wolff, the mental experience of the impossibility to judge that something is and is not is only the illustration of the validity of the PC as a principle of truth, rather than the establishment of the PC itself, as it was the case in Wolff. So it's only sort of to prove that the PC is true and that we cannot deny it. It's not what the PC is or establishes. So further on she says, "This axiom is the foundation of all certainty in human knowledge, for if one once granted that something may exist and not exist at the same time, there would no longer be any truth, even in numbers, and everything could be or not be according to the fantasy of each person. Thus 2 and 2 could equally make 4 or 6, or both sums at the same time." So what I want to show here is the PC is from the very beginning a form of correct judgments for du Châtelet. So it's not just if A, then for Wolff it was if A is B, I cannot judge that A is not B. And we could replace this with 2 plus 2 is 6. If I say 2 plus 2 is 6, I cannot judge that 2 plus 2 is not 6. And we have a sort of perfectly Wolffian equation, but not for du Châtelet. It's already a form of correct judgments or ideas. So how does the PC fulfill this role as a principle of knowledge or of correct judgments for du Châtelet? And to this end, to understand this, it makes sense to see how the PC relates to beings for her. So she says, I quote, "Therefore one calls a being," that's in chapter 3, "that which can exist and whose determinations do not imply any contradiction, whether this being exists or whether it is only possible. For we often speak of past or future beings, and as a result give the name being to all that is possible, whether it exists or not." And the line of argumentation she has here is, everything's possible that's not contradictory, so that's based on the PC. The impossible is basically a contradictory idea, so a confusion because we are sort of led away from the PC. And then the third step is, a being is that whose determinations do not imply any contradiction. So we can see here that what a being is established on the basis of the PC itself. Now, Wolff provides us with a definition of a thing on the basis of the PC as well. We have to bear in mind, however, that the determination of being in du Châtelet rests on the PC as a principle of truth or knowledge, while in Wolff, this determination rests on the PC as a form of judgment. So in Wolff, beings are non-contradictory because non-contradiction as a principle of the mind is attributed to them. For Du Châtelet, this is different. Beings are non-contradictory in and of themselves. It's, so to speak, the essential part that makes them a being. What a being or a thing is in Du Châtelet is thus not derived of the human mind or a form of judgment, but of the PC as a principle of truth or knowledge, a principle of beings in and of themselves, and a principle of the mind simultaneously. So a few paragraphs later, the PC is introduced by Du Châtelet as the principle of our judgment by which we can affirm properties of beings and judge the intrinsic I wanted to draw attention to this first. Yeah. So what she says here is, and it's quite an interesting passage. I quote, "Divine understanding," that's in chapter 3 as well, "divine understanding is the source of all that is possible, because all possible things with all their possible determinations are contained therein. But the essences of things, that is to say, the first determinations by the combination of which they become possible, and from which all their properties flow, have their foundation in the principle of contradiction. They are possible because it does not imply any contradiction that such or such determinations can be assembled in such and such a way." So this paragraph has often been read as sort of the possible is kind of only in God's mind, but I don't think that's actually what she wants to say. I think she wants to say, of course, everything that's possible is in the divine mind, but God, by creating the world, has already created certain possible determinations, and they form the essences of the beings we can know. When saying that the PC is the foundation of the essences of things or beings, I think she thinks beings in this way are understandable to us, to the human mind. And that's why she says this explicitly with reference to chapter 2. Like in chapter 3, she makes an explicit reference when she says this to chapter 2 to sort of say, well, God cannot change the essences of things. So God cannot change the eternal and invariable determinations by which beings become possible. So God cannot sort of will something else now, because the essences that what makes things possible, they are invariable and eternal and are sort of accessible by us through the PC. And a few paragraphs later, the PC is introduced by Du Châtelet as the principle of our judgment by which we can affirm properties of beings and judge the intrinsic possibility of a being. She writes, "Thus, when it is a question of admitting some properties in a being, one must see if this property follows from its essence, that is to say, from the primordial determinations that make it possible. For insofar as a being is considered alone, one must not show its intrinsic possibility by the principle of contradiction, and its external possibility or its actuality by the principle of sufficient reason, and from there deduce the attributes of this being and the modes to which it is susceptible. The PC has thus to be understood as being a principle for what beings are, as the object, and a principle of the mind, as the subject. A being and an idea we have of an object are codependent correlates. A contradictory idea is a chimera and does not represent a being. So we have an idea, and if that idea is non-contradictory, it's correct. It represents a being that is also non-contradictory. And if there's a contradiction in an idea, it's not actually an idea, it's a chimera. The PC and Du Châtelet. On this basis, we might be led to believe that beings in their possibility, so in their essence, on the basis of the PC is a mere logical determination of being, something that's not really got to do with any being, like physical actual beings. While beings in their actuality on the basis of the PSR are real or existing beings, so as if they came apart. But du Châtelet makes clear that beings, so essences, can exist, and that in all existing beings that surround us, she says, their essence is their eternal possibility. So she gives some examples of this. So, for example, the first two sides of a triangle are the essence of this, essential determinations of this triangle. They form the essence of this triangle. And that's such if we've drawn a triangle or not. And by drawing the triangle, we actualize the triangle. But if we think about it, it's still the case that this drawn triangle has the same essence of these two sides than if we hadn't sort of drawn the triangle. And the other example is the example of a stone. She says the essential determinations of a stone are hardness, heaviness, and being composed of parts. And we can imagine that if we have an actual stone, they're also hard and heavy and divisible, right? So I can sort of say in an actualized being, the possibility or the essence is actualized, and they don't just come apart. So the PC does not establish a mere logical determination of a being, but determines real and actual beings with regard to their essence. The PC for du Châtelet is thus a principle of beings, I say, and a principle of the mind. And I think they are ontologically and epistemologically on the same level. So as a principle of beings, it's a principle which is the foundation of what all beings, including the real beings that surround us, are in their essence or their possibility. As a principle of the mind, it's also an intuitive principle of the mind for us knowing or having beings in the first place. It's then also a principle of the sciences, because we have to reflect on how we have a world of beings in the first place. So we have to make sure that our judgments in the sciences adhere to this way in which we have a world of beings in the first place, and that our imagination has not led us astray from this principal knowledge of the world through a large number of conclusions where we've lost sight of this principal knowledge we have of the world. And the PC actually creates truth or knowledge and is the very foundation of it, by it being a principle of beings and of the mind that knows beings. And it's restricted to the possibility or the essence of beings, because the PSR pertains to the actuality of beings and our knowledge of the actuality of beings. That would be a different paper to explain, but it's important to note here that actual beings have essences. So essences are not just something in the divine mind. The PC for du Châtelet is not only a tool for the discovery of truths. It's not innate, at least not if we say that it being a principle of the external, it's of external beings that surround us. We could say that it's innate to them, but because actual beings are also sort of the very definition of being something outside of us, at least the question of innateness is debatable. And it's not solely a logical form of judgment, and also not primarily a logical form of judgment. And it's not the foundation of the PSR. I think she thinks that the PSR is just as foundational. We know the essences of things first. It's the first thing by which we know a being. So that's, I think, the reason why she says the PC is the first axiom of truth, but then says that the PSR is neither less fundamental nor less absolute, I think. So to sum it up, while Leibniz and Wolff are important references for the PC, her PC cannot be called Leibnizian or Wolffian, because the PC is one of the two fundamental principles of knowledge. It relates to her definition of being, and it has consequences for the PSR. We can also say that her account of knowledge and her ontology is not Leibnizian or Wolffian, at least not in any deeper sense as in Wolff is a Cartesian. We thus have to ask ourselves in what way her metaphysics can be said to be Leibnizian or Wolffian, maybe not at all.